Would you believe that despite how advanced automotive CFD is, the effects of a tire's tread on the flow is still unknown? I should know because I worked on this exact topic for a while, and it might seem like an easy thing to find out. You literally just put a car with treaded tires into either a wind tunnel or into CFD and see how the flow is affected. And while it might seem that easy, it's actually a little more complicated than that. So for example, in a wind tunnel, you can test different tire treads, but two main problems occur with most wind tunnels. The first is that it can be difficult to get equipment that can measure the flow very close to the tire surface. Because the tire is spinning so fast, the flow inside the grooves is difficult to capture even by non-intrusive methods like PIV. The second problem that arises is that there are so many different tire tread patterns out there that even if you were to test like 50 different patterns, there's no guarantee that that information will apply to another pattern. Now, one way around that is to try to break down the tread pattern into fundamental patterns. So for example, longitudinal grooves, which are those grooves that run along the entire tire. And while that is a good approach, still a problem occurs as to how wide and deep they should be. How close or far apart should they be? So for example, you might notice that on some tires that there are these grooves that are fairly equi-spaced, but then on other tires, some are then closer and then others are farther apart depending on where they are on the actual tire's face. And that's just some of the problems that the tire treads hold. If we go to CFD, then we get a whole new set of problems, and namely how to simulate them. Again, it might seem strange. I mean, you just stick it into CFD and then you should be good to go. But there's actually more that needs to be considered than just that. So first and foremost, the wheels rotate. That rotation needs to be factored in somehow. The traditional way is to use MRFs, but sliding meshes have become even more common in industry now. So just quickly, I'll explain what a sliding mesh is. It's effectively where you have one mesh that is rotating and then another mesh around that. And then at the interface between these two meshes, information is shared, so you can factor in what the flow is doing inside the wheel region, inside that rotating region, and then how it's affecting the outside region, and then vice versa. And that might seem like a great approach, except tires aren't axisymmetric. Rims are, tires aren't. The rubber bits on the outsides of the wheels deform. And you can see this very easily if you were to go literally just outside right now. Look at the nearest parked car. Where the tires meet the road, they should be squished, and that's all from the weight of the car on them. And I'm actually always surprised that when I think about just how little of the tires are actually supporting the weight of the cars. So the area of the tires that are actually in contact with the road is only about the size of a handprint. That's it. So you literally have 4 handprint sizes, and that's all that's keeping the car on the road and stopping it from spinning out and crashing. That's pretty amazing. And because so little of the tire is supported by the car, where the tires meet the road, the rubber bulges out. And we can kind of see that if we scroll to figures 6 and 7 here. We'll cover them a little bit later on in more detail, but there is a bit of a bulge here. Anyway, that bulge means that the tires are not axisymmetric. But it doesn't stop there, because the wheels are rotating so fast. What's actually happening is that because of the centrifugal forces that are created, the rubber is being thrown away and then it stretches. And then as the tire actually rotates around, the rubber is thrown into the ground, and as the tires are rotating back up, the rubber gets pulled up and gets stretched away from the road. All that means is that the tires are deforming in a very non-axisymmetric way. But you might be wondering, well, big deal. When it comes to CFD, it is a big deal because the standard sliding mesh approach needs an axisymmetric region to rotate. If you have a non-axisymmetric region, then it can't rotate. The reason is fairly intuitive. So if you start off with the sliding mesh and then the surrounding mesh, those two different regions tessellate perfectly together. They meet it perfectly on that interface. But in the next time step where the wheel has rotated now, even if it's a degree or even less, if the mesh is not axisymmetric, then you have now a mismatch between the sliding mesh and the surrounding mesh because they don't fit together. That sliding mesh is deformed and it rotates a little, but then the surrounding mesh is deformed but not rotated. That causes the CFD to crash because for a couple of reasons, one being a lack of information to pass between the regions that are now disjointed and too far away from each other, and then too much information in the regions which are now overlapping because you have the deformed part of one bit overlapping the non-deformed part of the other bit. And that single problem, the deformation, has prevented us from being able to CFD tires with tread. So one simple solution would be to shoot the tires so they run flat and then let high speed rip them off of the rims. So then now you only have rims rolling on the ground. Rims are actually symmetric, so no problems now. I don't remember suggesting this when I was working on this problem, but either way, it's my idea, and if anyone steals it, I know. The other approach to solving this problem, which the researchers in this paper have taken, is to figure out a way to CFD deform tires. So in reality, it's actually not that hard to CFD deform tires. There are a few ways you could do it. The first is to use an immersed boundary method. The second is to use something like an overset mesh where the overset part can deform. Those are just a couple ways. But while the ideas are fine, the problem comes in practice. So the hard bit about CFDing deformed tires is coming up with a way that won't take too long to simulate. So in this podcast, we'll go through briefly the methods that these researchers use to simulate a deformed treaded tire and the aerodynamics around such a tire. The second part is interesting because in practice, we know that the tread does change the flow physics, and we'll cover why later in this video. So this paper is called, if I scroll up here, Space-Time Isogeometric Analysis of Tire Aerodynamics with Complex Tread Pattern, Road Contact, and Tire Deformation. It's open access, so you can find the link below, and the DOI is at the end of the page here. Just around, is at the top maybe. Anyway, at the top here. So just quickly, if you'd like us to simulate your very own car, then let us know here. Let's move on to the method they used first though. So the authors say that this is the first of its kind, and to be completely clear, I don't completely understand this. So for example, there are a bunch of different acronyms they use to describe the entire process. So they have STVism, STSUPS, STC, STTIC, STIGA, just ego down here, NZMGUM, SIGJUM, and FRIHMUM. Many acronyms. Now I read through all of this, and because it's so new, I think the only ones who truly understand all this are the authors themselves. But from what I understood, this process for the CFD literally boils down to, first of all, they're using a fluid structure interaction approach. What that means is that the structures in the CFD can deform, and then the CFD is applied after that. So the deformation is taken into account through FEA. But the way they did this fluid structure interaction process is effectively a sliding mesh where we have mesh generation as well. So the wheel is in its own mesh region and it can deform its mesh too. Then as it rotates, the surrounding mesh remeshes to accommodate this non-axisymmetric mesh now. Then the simulation process progresses through this process each time step. And then to solve the problem of having missing cells between external meshes and the sliding bit, a form of local mesh generation took place. That effectively what the explanation here boils down to. The authors might have some more details on it, but I couldn't see anything more in this general description here. Oh, and I should mention that when the additional mesh was generated, there was effectively empty cells. So no information about what was going on in the flow was in these cells. So the authors interpolated values in the neighboring regions to gauge what would happen in these new cells occupying these mismatched regions. Anyway, that is the general CFD method. In figures 2 to 5, we get a good appreciation of the tread features these authors simulated. So they not only have longitudinal grooves, so the ones that go around the tire, but they have incredibly detailed lateral grooves. So the level of detail here is pretty impressive. One thing to notice is that the lateral grooves, some are perpendicular to the longitudinal grooves, but then some are at an angle, and then some are even curved a little bit. And that is what I was talking about earlier, where tread patterns can be so complex that trying to decode them into basic building blocks is difficult. Not to mention the synergistic effects between them that they might have, and some do have. We know that. Let's now jump to figure 6 and 7 to see just how much deformation there is for a regular wheel. So the left is the tire without any tread, and the right is the tire with tread. The color bars are in millimeters of deformation. One thing that stands out to me is that the tread doesn't seem to make much of a difference to the deformation. It seems like both are pretty much deforming the same amount. That's good to know. As for the actual deformation, the closer you get to the contact patch and actually to the middle of contact patch, the deformation is occurring more and more, almost up to an inch here, so 21 millimeters about. Also, if you look at the sides of the wheels, so the left and right parts, you can see light blue regions. So there's maybe about 5 millimeters of deformation here. and this was at 100 kph. And if you rotate the wheels faster, the deformation on the wheels will increase, mostly around the sides. The contact patch deformation will actually reduce a little bit usually, because the car lifts up a little bit the faster you go, at least regular cars. Cars with a lot more downforce can move closer to the ground. Now the CFD doesn't have any validation, at least from what I can tell, nor does it seem to have a good independent study. Neither of those are good, so I think we should just take the results with a grain of salt. Anyway, for their CFD, they simulated the wheel in an open domain, which you can see in figure 9. It's really big and it's a good size for just a single wheel. So early on, I mentioned how simulating a treaded wheel wasn't actually hard, at least in theory. It was when it comes to practice, though. That's when the problems arise. We can kind of see that here. So for their entire domain, this entire massive domain with just one wheel in it, they only used 650,000 cells. That's it. So if you were to do a regular car simulation, you'd use probably around 100 million cells. So that's for the entire domain with the car. And for the wheels, each one without tread, you're looking at around 5 million cells for a regular car. But because of this highly computationally expensive CFD approach, the authors, I'm quite sure, are limited to less than 1 million cells. So these authors were limited to less than 1 million for just one wheel. If you were to factor in the other 3 wheels plus the car, it's easy to see how prohibitive this simulating this treaded wheel will become. And I'm quite certain that they're not trying to skimp on the resources needed, because they say that the time step they used was 7.5 by 10 to the negative 5 seconds, which is a very typical time step used in automotive simulations. It's just that it's so computationally expensive that 650,000 cells is the likely upper limit that they could use here. So let's just keep that in mind, that the results are unvalidated. So let's just look at the general trends, which is actually what they gave too. There's no force data. But we'll see later on, actually, some of the general trends agree with some force data that I've taken in the past. I'll talk about that in a second. But anyway, just on the topic of CFD, if you'd like to learn OpenFOAM, which is a completely free and powerful CFD software, then check out our courses below. Let's now get into the results. So in figure 10, we see what the authors say is the second invariant of the velocity gradient tensor. What this is literally the Q-criterion isosurfaces plotted. Q-criterion, for those who don't know, is just a way of determining if a vortex actually exists or not. And the isosurface is everywhere in the flow where the value is equal to or exceeds a certain threshold. Here it looks like about a bit above 0. Anyway, what all that means is that this plot shows where vortices are on the wheel. That's the meaning of it. One thing I should say is it would have been good if they had the slick wheel next to it as well, so we could tell the difference between the treaded and the slick wheels. Anyway, going from the top to the bottom is the tire rotating at different time steps. And I have to say that macroscopically, there's pretty much no difference between time steps. So the effects the tread is having is highly localized. What also is quite obvious is that around the leading edge shoulder here, so the edge at the front, the lateral grooves seem to break up the vortices into many smaller ones. Because we don't know what the slick tire is doing here, we don't know for sure, but I think that the lateral grooves are probably reducing the larger vortices coherency and how much they propagate downstream. I mean, if you have these little grooves making smaller vortices and not letting all the vorticity roll up into larger vortices, but rather siphoning some of that off to create smaller ones, then it makes sense that the larger one should be weaker. And one thing that I'm surprised at is that there are no vortices on the front face. I thought maybe that because the incoming flow would be at an angle to some of the grooves at least, even a small angle, some vorticity and then vortices would be created, but pretty much nothing is created here, just tiny nothings. Oh yeah, one more thing I forgot to mention is that when we were talking about how trying to measure the flow around a treaded tire in a wind tunnel was problematic, that's because trying to get instantaneous data is next to impossible because of the little gaps in the groove. Even something like tomographic PIV can't get inside these little grooves well. The angles just don't work too well. So CFD gives us good instantaneous data we can't get in experiments. Anyway, in figure 11, so on the right here, we now see the vortices on the top of the wheel on the left and then underneath the wheel on the right. These again are at different time steps, and so for a regular wheel, a jetting vortex pair will form underneath. We can see that jetting vortex pair pretty clearly underneath. You can see these on either side, there are these blue globs. That's a vortex on each side. On top, there is usually a vortex pair, but we don't see it here. I think the tread is breaking it up, so it definitely isn't a coherent one. And that kind of makes sense again because the jetting vortices aren't directly coming from the grooves. They roll up because there is too much flow that has to go underneath the wheel. So they just go around the side. So the grooves won't affect it directly. For the vortices on top, the surface's texture is a major factor in their development, so I think it makes sense how some of the grooves are breaking the vortex system up. They're siphoning some of that vorticity off into smaller ones and not letting it roll up into larger ones, not like the jetting vortex system. So that I think makes sense. Now in figure 12, we see some information that might be the most important information we've seen. So let me zoom in a little bit here. It might not seem like much, but I'll explain in a second why this is so important, if I can go across. It's childproof at the moment, but yeah, here we go. So what we're seeing here is a horizontal plane cutting through 5.9 millimeters off the ground. The velocity is plotted on the right, on it, with some velocity vectors showing the path of the flow, but they're a little hard to see. Anyway, as we go from top to bottom, we see different time steps. The important thing to note here is that the front left edge, so the one closest to us, how close the lateral groove is to the front of the first one. The reason I say that is because if you look down the plots, you can see that depending on where the lateral groove is, the flow behaves a little differently. So on the top plot, which is where the groove is pretty much at the front of the tread, the red flow goes around the wheel, then hits the lateral grooves and then separates and creates a wake. Literally, as soon as you hit the lateral groove, there's a wake behind that. In a second plot, the lateral groove is a little further back, and we have one block of tread about just before it, in front of it. The flow comes around it now and separates at the edge, but not it, like reattaches. Then the wake is smaller now. Then in the third plot, if we scroll down, which is where we have a lateral groove even further forwards, the flow hits it and it separates and we get a pretty large wake behind it. So what these plots are showing is that, and the other two as well, is that the lateral groove is effectively determining where the flow will separate around the tire shoulder. As soon as the flow hits it, it separates. It might not seem like much because it's literally just the difference between a centimeter or two downstream where the flow separates, but the wake is affected, and it shows how this lateral groove might negate the effects of the shoulder radius. So in wheel research up until now, the shoulder sharpness has played a large role. It greatly affects the results with rounder shoulders keeping the flow attached, and that reduces the wake size. Sharper shoulders make the flow detach and creates a larger wake, and particularly in earlier research of wheels and tires, this created a major discrepancy between a lot of different research publications where some tires were showing certain features in the flow, others were showing different ones, and a lot of this was coming from the tire shoulder sharpness. Here, the lateral grooves are effectively negating that difference because as soon as the flow hits them, it separates and a wake is formed. So in a way, while simulating lateral grooves is harder because it kind of simplified, but then again, because it kind of the simplification to the shoulder's effects, it makes the CFD a little easier from that approach. At the very least, it's pretty obvious from these plots that the lateral groove triggers flow separation. So going down the side, the lateral grooves from here seem to jettison higher speed flow out. That is going to increase the wake a little, and it makes sense why it does that as you have the tire squeezing onto the ground. The area is being squeezed too and has to go out through some grooves. And the lateral grooves here are where it can exit into the rest of the flow. So they're all being channeled through this. So it really seems to make sense that the lateral grooves are just spoiling the flow here. They make the flow separate around the shoulder regardless of whether, I'm pretty sure whether it would be sharp or rounded, the lateral grooves are really affecting that. And then they make the wake around the sides larger too. So one thing we can't quite tell here is because we don't have the slick tires, but it's still pretty clear, I guess, is that the longitudinal grooves are producing channels for the flow at the front to funnel back into the wake at the rear, and then get some higher energy flow going there. But more surprising to me is how fast the flow is at the back of the wheel. So it's really red. That is literally just chaotic wake rushing in, and it has a lot of energy still. And with that, we come to the end of this podcast. I was really impressed with these lateral grooves. I think they were clear here. The takeaway message is that lateral grooves are bad, and some force data that I've taken also shows that, like, usually increase the drag of a car by 1 to 2%, and that's pretty consistent across different rims as well and different wheels. But we can kind of see here why, because they really do trigger separation and a larger wake around the sides. So if you like this podcast, hit the me, likey, and subscribe buttons. And if you want to learn OpenFoam, then check out our courses below. And if you'd like us to simulate your very own car, let us know below. And if you're staying on YouTube, YouTube thinks you like this video, so check it out. Peace out, amigos.